joined us. This is more or less going to be the volume at which we will deliver the webinar this morning. So if you want to adjust your volume accordingly. For those of you interested in CCA credits, if you don't sign in with your name and number, you can add your name in the left-hand chat box. And if you would put your full name, not just your first name, and your CCA, let's see, what do we call those? Your number. We will make sure that you get credit for participating today. Now, if you have questions during the course of the workshop or the webinar, if you could type those in, and we will take questions after each of the three speakers this morning. For those of you that have questions, we'll take those in audio form or as a text question after the end of each, but we'll be somewhat limited so that we can keep on time. Anything else from the body? If not, I will go ahead and proceed. I'm Joel Ransom, Extension Agronomist for cereal crops, and my topic today will be talking about evaluating wheat stands in the spring and management practices associated with decisions that come from a knowledge of the type of stand that is likely to be out there. Just a quick review of the factors that impact winter wheat survival. First of all, the environment, temperatures at the crown depth are most definitive. We did have an open winter, so we had plenty of concern that we would have some death of our winter wheat. Fortunately, I believe that for most of the winter we didn't have those cold temperatures, and so even without the snow cover, we didn't see the real low temperatures at the crown of the winter wheat that we might have expected. The next factor would be the state of hardening or the time of the year. I'll show you in the next graph that there is a process of hardening, and as you can imagine, we come out of that process in the spring, and so at this time of the year we are quite sensitive to low temperatures, even though we may have survived the worst part of cold weather in the winter. The variety sown is another factor, and the size and the vigor of the plant in the fall. So if they're evaluating crop stands, we're going to see a lot of variety in the size of the plant in the fall. We're going to see a lot of variety in the varieties of winter wheat that we're sowing, and so those are going to have an impact on the type of survival that we see. Just a quick graph to show you some of the kind of to integrate the effects of crown depth, soil temperatures, and variety. These are based on the model put together in Canada, Dr. Fowler, and you can see that this lower line here would be an indication of the minimum temperature that would be that a variety like Susceptible would be able to tolerate, and that as the season progresses, that line tends to move up because the plant is using up such reserves, and particularly as we see over here in Sherwood that when temperatures get close to that minimum temperature, that actually the ability of the plant to survive cold temperatures diminishes, and in the case of Sherwood, this estimated that there would have been some death of winter wheat. Now, these are the classical graphs that show the susceptibility of winter wheat to cold at different times of the year. The top graph would be dealing with data from Kansas, And as you see, we are now in the middle of March. Those data would suggest that a temperature of about 10 degrees could cause winter wheat to be killed. We look at the data from Canada. Certainly, one can see that it is probably more delayed in the process, and one could imagine that in February the temperatures are still colder in Canada than they would be in Kansas. But typically about that middle of March period, one could expect that winter wheat becomes susceptible at about, I don't know, we have it at 14 degrees centigrade, which translates into, let me check my notes here. Well, 12 degrees centigrade would be 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So currently we're well above those temperatures. So I don't think we have immediate concern depending on what kind of weather we have in the future. And just to remind you again of the effect of bar, looking at some of the data from 2003, 2004, where I was able to monitor big differences in winter survival. One can see that these varieties over here in soybean residue that didn't have good snow cover, Jaggeline, Millennium, New Plain, we had only about 20-30% survival versus those that were more winter hardy that had very good winter survival under the same kind of situation. So that's kind of the situation we see out in the field. We have a number of varieties that are growing that are not particularly winter hardy, and of course we have quite a few that are well adapted to our environment. Probably no surprise if we see some variability in winter survival. And another factor that I briefly talked about was the size of the seedling going into the fall, and here's a great example of, a larger plant having much more vigor in the spring compared to a smaller plant because of the that it has. And undoubtedly, we have some late planted good crop out there that would be more like the lower plants, and we had some that we planted quite early that would be more like the upper plants. So let's talk about stand evaluation. I think the kind of a three step process that I would recommend is, first of all, take a representative area of the field, count the growing plants, probably several 2 feet length should be adequate. Nothing needs to be too definitive to give you a ballpark kind of estimate of the number of surviving plants. I'd also look at the broader scale of the field and look for patchiness. Are there big areas that plants are missing versus kind of plants regularly missing throughout the row? And again, I think one should evaluate for vigor because even though we have a live plant, a plant that is kind of just hanging in is going to have probably need a little more different management than one that's vigorously growing. What are our recommendations? Well, optimally, we'd like to have about 20 to 25 plants per square foot. But stands between 12 to 15 plants are generally more than adequate. And stands of 6 to 8 plants have yielded well in many situations. And I think the determining factor when you get into the lower levels is how uniform that those kinds of scenarios might be. That if we have 6 to 8 plants, which is far below what we would consider optimum, but if that's pretty consistent throughout the field, no large patches, that would be the kind of scenario that I think one could hang in there with and expect to have some reasonable yield. And just to note that winter wheat does have better capacity for filling in the gaps than spring wheat. And you can see our minimum recommendations here on the right-hand side for winter wheat would be down to as low as 5 plants per foot squared, whereas with spring wheat, we'd probably want about 50% more than that in many cases. So just remember that winter wheat does have the capacity to fill in nicely. Let's just follow up on that. Probably at the point, actually some of the fields that I've seen have already greened up, but it might not be unusual for you to see a field that looks something like that coming out of the winter. All the tissue on the top has been frozen. But the fact that the upper leaves from the fall have been burned off doesn't mean that the plant is dead. If you're really anxious and you have some areas where you don't see some regrowth, you might do a bag test, and you can either just bring the plant back into the house or the lab, put it in a bag, or you could actually pull out the seedlings, trim it back, and put it in a bag like this. And it's amazing if those plants will survive, it'll start to re-sprout within 12 to 24 hours. So just some data on kind of surviving plants per meter square and yield, and these are data that were put together by Steve Dwarf in Canada, and you can see that we really, when we get into these areas of kind of less than 8, that's when we start to be concerned about the yield potential. And the fact you've got the crop out there, you don't have to plant it, you don't have to tear it up, probably would suggest that you can tolerate these populations even below 8 in many cases. This is some data that we had from Castleton in 2004, a nice relationship between survival and yield. And just note here that down here at 30% of our targeted stand, we still were able to get 80 bushel yields. So an indication that winter wheat does have the capacity to fill in the missing spots. These are some data that Steve Dvorak put together. A nice data set, 44 different trials looking at winter survival, and one can see that it's really a point of concern for yield, kind of when you get to that 40% of the desired stand when one gets concerned. And if you take winter wheat yield, when you take that same data and look at 50% or less, you get a better feel for that. That again, that kind of that 40% is a reasonable break off, and you might have some scenarios even at 30 to 25% stand that you're pulling in yields that are considered acceptable. Winter wheat, and this is of course looking at the 50% or more, showing that pretty big range where things are still viable. So what do you do if you end up with a field that's a little bit thin? Obviously, if you've made a decision to keep the field, one of the options would be to make sure that you get out there and put a little nitrogen on early, particularly if you see that the vigor is compromised. Blake's going to talk a little bit more about that, and I want to do your weed control early, and you want to make sure that if you've got some disease working out there, you probably want to make sure that you do a good job of early season disease control. I think one of the challenges at this point would be what happens when you have a field where you have large patches. What do you want to do with the remaining dead areas? And there's one option would be that you fill it in with spring wheat. Mixing classes is always a bit of problematic, but it's some way that you can kind of manage the weeds and nurse things along. there may be, it might be that you just leave it as it is and control the weeds well. So I want to conclude by saying that in many of our locations, the reports have been favorable for winter wheat survival. The winter wheat we have here in Prosper are greened up and is doing quite nicely. And the question is, are we out of the woods? Got a quick slide here showing that our current 1-month outlook predicts above us temperatures, which I think is favorable. A little more detailed map, and you can see squiggles all over, and I hope you don't feel like you have to study that, but I think this was the only date in the next 16-day period that showed any type of below freezing temperatures. That'd be kind of that 20 to 28 period. And so it does look likely that we won't have the kinds of temperatures that are likely to do damage, but everything is subject to change. And the other thing is, we still have challenges of water. This is out in Prosper where we have some standing water in our plots. And so maybe we're out of the woods with regard to temperature, but we still have normal challenges of getting the crop in a situation where it will grow nicely and take off. But I think with that, I'd like to conclude, and if there are any questions, I'll take a couple of questions before I hand over to Marcia.
Say, Joel. Joel, do you have any suggestions, like with the water situation? Any management suggestions there?
I hope you don't have fills like we do, but the only thing on the positive side is that temperatures are low, and so the winter wheat can tolerate an epoxia or being waterlogged longer than when the temperatures are warm. I'm assuming that part of the problem is that the frost layer in the soil, and we haven't had water moving down. But I don't have any suggestions, and I'm quite concerned that we might have some damage just from that excess water after getting the crop all through the winter. That's pretty discouraging. Okay, Tyler's got a question here. Do you recommend spraying across wheat fields? And not exactly sure what that would entail, but I would certainly recommend that, instead of going with the rows, I don't have any recommend there. I think I think that either way, you're going to probably have the same kind of impression on the plants. I better hand it over to Marcia. My time's up. Thank you for your attention, and there may be some additional time at the end of the seminar. We're not going to hang up at exactly the hour, but we want to wrap things up, and so feel free to write some questions down, and we'll try to deal with those at the end too.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is Marcia McMullen, and I'm going to be talking about some of the diseases that have the potential to be a problem based on the 2011 experience. And so the diseases I have listed here are the virus diseases, rust, the fungal leaf spot complex, Fusarium head blight, and bacterial leaf streak. Last year, we saw most of these diseases quite prevalent throughout the state based on environmental conditions that occurred last year. We don't know yet what's going to happen during the growing season, so we have to prepare for all of these potential problems. We had wheat streak mosaic last year show up early. Mid-June, Barley yellow dwarf started showing up. Later on, we also had tan spot early, and then later on we got some bacterial streak head symptoms in winter wheat across the state. One thing we did not see much of last year were any of the rust diseases, and we still don't know the potential for those for 2012. Oops, excuse me, I went one too far. Wheat streak mosaic virus, I will miss first because this would be the disease that we would anticipate appearing first if we had carryover in volunteer winter wheat or grassy weeds from 2011. I am hopeful that we had good management of our volunteers in grassy weeds last fall because we had an extended fall and it did have to get in and do some management strategies they couldn't do the year before. But these are the symptoms of wheat streak mosaic. On the left is a volunteer field that was showing a lot of wheat streak several years ago. And up on the top are the symptoms of wheat streak, the streaky mosaic appearance of the leaves. And then I also am illustrating, of course, the carrier of this virus, and that is the wheat curl mite. And so we know that is a very tiny mite. It's only 1/100th of an inch long, so you won't see the mite, but you certainly can see the symptoms if they're present. All right, this is a cycle of the wheat streak mosaic virus disease, and of course, it's dependent on the survival of the mite that transmits the virus. The virus doesn't spread otherwise, and so right now I have circled where that mite could be living right now. That would be active winter wheat or volunteers, and then the risk of it would be for it to increase during the spring or move into adjacent spring wheat plants. So our goal is to break the cycle of the mite. That's the only way we can control this disease, and that is with providing good, clean fields when you're planting. With winter wheat, of course, that management strategy has already been implemented, I hope, and successfully. But this spring, if you do see some volunteers nearby that may have this disease, you could still use herbicides to manage those volunteers so we don't get additional movement of that mite. And we also want to be sure that we protect spring wheat in the area as well. And if you do suspect the disease, you see some of those symptoms, you can send plant samples to our end-issue diagnostic lab. They test for the virus, and they can get an answer in 2 to 3 days. And then if it was positive, other decisions would have to be made on whether those fields would be kept or not. Another virus disease that we saw a considerable amount of last year was Barley yellow dwarf virus. Late in the season, you see those golden tips of flag leaves that were very prominent last year, or you might see a lighter yellowing earlier in the season.
Let's go ahead. Which number do we know you're at? For some reason it went away.
Excuse us, we have a little, should be right here.
Yeah.
Had a little technology glitch. Okay. Barley yellow dwarf, of course, is transmitted by grain aphids. And grain aphids are visible to the naked eye, and we would greatly encourage field scouting for grain aphids this year. Last year we found them in the canopy around June 15th, and they were along the bottom leaves of the canopy, so a lot of people didn't see them. But we can manage this disease with aphid control. Last year, as I mentioned, we saw them about June 15th. Jan Canodal released information on aphid control on June 23rd, and we did advise farmers to use insecticides if they found aphids at that early time, because we knew that there was a potential for a problem. This year, again, barley yellow dwarf control depends on aphid movement from the south. The wheat curl mite is here. The aphids have been from southern plains states. And I just wanted to indicate to you that as of a few weeks ago, Oklahoma pathologists was reporting abundant barley yellow dwarf virus and bird cherry oat aphid in wheat, in winter wheat in Oklahoma. So if the situation would be that we would have prevailing winds and those aphid populations are increasing in southern plain states, we would have a potential for problems. But aphids may be controlled with insecticides if scouting indicates there are aphids present. Last year, we also saw a considerable amount of bacterial leaf streak in winter wheat and spring wheat, and it's caused by a bacterium that is present in residue soil and perhaps on the leaf bough, and it's moved by splashing rain, and it needs wounds in the leaf surface to enter the plant, and that's created by the soil moving with the wind and the rain. Currently, we know some varieties are more susceptible, but we really don't have a lot of information on variety response in winter wheat, and we don't have current management strategies to recommend. So know that a lot of the breeders are looking for resistance. And for example, here at NDSU, they are currently searching for resistance in over 500 spring wheat accessions, and they have already identified resistance to bacterial leaf streak in 35 winter wheat accessions. So that is good news. And we've also had chemicals and bio-based products for control that haven't been very successful with those products. If we would have a drier summer, I don't anticipate bacterial leaf streak would be as prevalent as it was in 2011. So if we move on to fungal leaf spot diseases and head diseases, we know that those are our most common and prevalent diseases most years in winter wheat, and we have quite a few of them. They are managed with a number of strategies: crop rotation, variety resistance, and fungicides. We do have a strategy for early season application of fungicides for managing early tan spot, and later application for managing even leaf spots and scab. And we have a little bit of data on a flagleaf application, but I don't recommend it except for if stripe rust would become a problem again. And I'll show some data in a minute. So this is from 2010, where they looked at susceptibility of winter wheat varieties to tan spot. And we had a variation in susceptibility, and you can see those varieties have a little more susceptibility, such as Boomer. And then if we look at some variety response to fungicides in 2011, this is a summary of fungicide response among winter wheat varieties that this was done at Mandan, where they did have quite a bit of moisture and leaf disease. And the fungicide strategy was early application of Stratego, followed by a late application of flowering of Prosaro. And the average response was 15.3 bushels. And you can see that, for example, Boomer had a good response. Cy Wolf, Syngenta variety, was probably the variety that had the least response to fungicides in that trial. So there are differences in varieties, but generally, I would say winter wheats have a fairly high level of susceptibility at this time to these leaf spot diseases and scab. This is some information summarized by John Lukach from last year, and he had 3 varieties he tested this fungicide trial on. He had the Accipiter, Hawken, and seed Falcon at 2 and this was over 2 locations. And I just wanted to point out, if you look at the bold values, he was looking at fungicide timing at early, flyleaf, and then flowering. And the 2 top responses were achieved with either the full fungicide program, early flag and flowering, or almost equal to just the early and the late application of fungicide. And in this one, he got about a 13 bushel response over those multiple locations and varieties. As far as leaf rust and other rust diseases last year, 2011 was a very quiet year compared to the previous year. And we know we have quite a bit of susceptibility in our varieties of winter wheat to leaf rust, for example. And this is just some ratings that we have in our variety trial bulletin. We do have information on how to use fungicide for leaf rust, tan spot, septoria, and scab, and some websites. And the issue has a crop disease forecasting model that you can access. And we have information on risk for these 3 diseases at any time during the growing season. And then we also have a disease forecasting model for scab. And you can also sign up for scab alerts, as indicated here. And these tell you the risk at any given time for these diseases. And it doesn't tell you the growth stage of your crop, but it does tell you the risk at that time based on the weather. And so these models are helpful tools in making fungicide decisions. Jeremy Peterson at Minot, when he was at Minot, and I just put this little chart together to try to look at the profitability of fungicides. And right now in this table, we just have how many bushels you need to break even from fungicide use at, say, a $4 an acre cost with ground application, for example. At these various prices of wheat, you would need between 1.1 up to 1.8 bushel plots, and I would say that we almost always get that with winter wheat. And then if you did a more complete application of fungicides with early followed by flowering, and I have that on the bottom, the product cost for that would be approximately $17 an acre. If you applied it by air, maybe $7, maybe a little higher, and the response that you would need for breaking even with that fungicide program would be about 3 bushels if wheat is $8, or 3.4 bushels if it's $7. So we have been achieving those easily in most locations, most varieties, most years with winter wheat. Of course, if we have a drier year, the disease forecasting model would indicate less risk, and then that decision would have to be made at that time. So those are the disease issues I see looming in 2012. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. I won't be here at the end of the program, so I would like you to ask questions now if you can. Okay, the question I see in front of me is, should we recommend spraying for mites as a management tool to help curb wheat streak mosaic? There is no recommendation from any university I know at this time to spray for wheat curl mites. A few products have been tested, but have not proved consistent, and the only ones that were consistent were in like Chemic, which was soil applied, and of course that isn't even available anymore, and it was very dangerous. So at this time, I have to say there is no product that we can recommend for spraying for wheat curl mites. Any other questions? Okay, well, then, hope you have a good day.
No, it's fine.
Well, hello to you folks out there. We've just a couple of notes here for you is that if you get a CCA and you want credit and you did not log in with your full name and your CCA number, please in the text box or the chat box, whatever you want to call it, enter your full name and your CCA number so we can get those recorded and get it over to the association and get your credits. The other thing we had indicated on the announcement that we had a bronze deer stalker for some lucky winner, and we were waiting for the 15 to log in, and that person did, and then she dropped off. Her name was Irene. But then another lucky person logged in after her, and that name was Orville Swenson. So Orville, please contact DU with your contact information at our office in Bismarck, if you would, and we've got a nice bronze sculptor for you for attending the seminar today. Okay, let's move on into the discussion here and nitrogen management a little. And Joel mentioned that we talk a little bit about early nitrogen management if we had poor vigor and poor stands, and we'll get into that towards the end of my session. But as we look at spring nitrogen and we think about amount and time of application,
It depends on a number of things. One is obviously your soil test and any fall applications you need to take into account. Obviously, it involves your soil types and resulting yield potential, precipitation amount and timing in terms of application, and winter injury and stand loss, nitrogen source, and then your resulting method of application, and then the protein management, more to avoid discounts than to talk about protein premiums. If we look at the amount of nitrogen, if we look at what the two universities are currently recommending, it's 2.5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of winter wheat for both SDSU and NDSU. I know NDSU is currently working on new recs and is going to be analyzing the data that the Winter Cereal Sustainability and Action Program is generating through Steve Dwarf and Jerry Pell and myself and John Lukach with NDSU at Langdon. And Dr. Cranston will be taking that information as we get more data over the next couple of years and taking a look at the NDSU recs. Some data from Dr. Al Black, who was with ARS at Mandan and Sydney for a long period of time. Data that he had put together over a number of years with winter wheat pointed that if you're for 12% protein, which is basically the marketing basis, 2.25 pounds per bushel is adequate. And we've been using that actual number in our DU trials across North and South Dakota over the last several years, and it seems to fall pretty close to that 12% protein number when you look at the amount of nitrogen applied for the yields that are out there. When you think about winter wheat and you start selecting your yield goals and you're thinking about your amount of nitrogen, one thing that I'd encourage you to be cognizant of, we look at the North Dakota Statistical Ag Service data or the USDA National Ag Service data. You'll note that the trend for winter wheat yields has increased pretty substantially since the start of this program with the two universities. And right now, when you look at the NAS data, 20% advantage for winter wheat over spring wheat, when you look at that yield trend over about a 9 or 10 year period. So keep in mind that we're probably looking at a 20 to 30% greater yield potential with winter wheat versus spring wheat to give you some kind of a basis or for comparison of where you might want to be at. Some of the current data, and I'm going to show you about 5 or 6 slides here consecutively, and it all goes back to John Lukach's and Steve and Jason's data over the last several years. John's data is 09, 10, and 11 years, and it's been done from east of Bottineau to Devil's Lake to Langdon in that circle. So there's a little bit of a microenvironment there. The yield potential is higher in that area, so we need to keep that in mind as we look at the NDSU data for Northeast North Dakota. But I think what you'll see there, this is total N now, soil test N or N in the soil plus the applied N. And you'll note that his yields are continuing to go up all the way into that 200 to 250 pound range of total nitrogen. If you look at the DU data, our stretch is 04 to 11, and we don't have as many set points in terms of application, nitrogen application. John has his applications done from 0 to 30 in 30 pound increments all the way up to 180 pounds, and ours are variable based on yield goals. But you'll note that in essence, our numbers are showing very similar, 200 to 250 pounds of total N for your maximum yield. You just need to remember that this is maximum yield and not maximum economic yield. Your economic application rate of nitrogen is going to be probably somewhat less than what the maximum yield is. If you look at just applied in or the fertilizer only, looking at the DU trials, you'll have that curve peaks out at a lower level, someplace between that 160 to probably 210 or 220, which makes sense because you have a soil test level that's in there probably someplace between 30 and 60 pounds on average. So that's one step backwards in terms of the amount of N that you need to apply. Looking at John's data, just looking at his UAN or his 28% in treatments over those 9 site years, in other words, 3 years at 3 different locations in that area, you can see that his yields are continuing to go up, even as he still is reaching that 180 pound N application rate. You'll note that the increase in the slope of the line is obviously decreasing once he gets past that 130 to 150 range. The slope is starting to go down. And I believe John is going to be adding another 30 pound increment to see where that yield level might potentially top out at. If you look at John's proteins, you know, he wasn't topping out with yields at the applied end of 180, and we're getting some verification that he probably hasn't topped out in yields by the fact that he hasn't reached 12% protein level at that 100 applied end rate as well. And so that's one of the things that and again, I'm sure John will be looking at to see where that protein eventually gets to 12% at what application rate that it takes to do that in that northeast North Dakota area. If you look at the Ducks Unlimited data, you know, we've had application rates all the way from 0 to 350 pounds of nitrogen, and we've been able to kind of reach that magical 12% level at around that 150 or 180 pounds and on up. So in reality, from an economic standpoint, we're probably going to be pretty close when we get done. John's levels might be slightly higher than the rest of the two Dakotas. John put together for me looking at the economic side of it, and this is the return to nitrogen. So in other words, it's the gross dollar volume minus the nitrogen cost. And you can see that he incorporated two different price levels for the wheat, a $4 and a $6 price level, and he has two different price levels for the nitrogen, 70 cents per pound and 50 cents per pound. And then he also incorporated a discount protein premium in one of the lines. The dotted lines are the ones that have no protein premiums or discounts. The solid lines in each of those brackets, it's a 30-cent discount per point or a 15-cent premium per point of protein. So if you look at the bottom set of four lines, the red and the orange, those are the $4 value for the wheat, and the red is the 75-cent end, and the orange is the 50-cent end. And so if you look at those, you'll note that with the cheaper nitrogen, the amount of N, total amount of N soil test plus applied, you know, he probably reaches maximum value someplace between 150 and 190 pounds to 200 pounds of N based on the cost of the nitrogen. If you look at the $6 N, which is the green and the blue lines, you'll note that bar or that amount applied, total amount applied, moves to the right, and we're looking at values probably from 180 up to about 220 to 30 pounds of N. And so this is just another way of looking at it. And again, this is total N, so it's your soil test N plus your applied N. So in terms of looking at the amount of nitrogen summary, I think we're pretty comfortable with that 2.25 to 2.5 pounds of N is adequate to get you to the 12% protein at this point in time until we get more data under our belts to be more definitive. If we're looking at total N, it appears that someplace between 200 and 250 pounds of N appears to be the level that will be needed to reach the maximum yield. Now, this is not considering economics. So the N to attain that maximum economic yield will depend on the price of the nitrogen and the wheat, as you noticed in that last slide. So when do we apply the N? And you'll note the very bottom thing in the blue is just before rain if you haven't applied it yet. But obviously the N can be applied at seeding time, or it can be applied in the early spring right now as it's breaking dormancy, or it can be applied at lining. In other words, at 4 to 5 leaf stage. If we get to the 6 leaf stage, that stem starting to erect itself, and we may have missed the optimum in terms of yield. It'll still help us with protein. And then we can also talk about protein management again to avoid discounts. We look at some data from 04 to 06 done in Dickey County, North Dakota, south central part of North Dakota, and we also done it in north central South Dakota at a site for the same 3 years, and the results were pretty similar with a little variance. But you'll notice if you look at the 3-year average on the far right, the check where no N was applied, the average is 54.6. The N at seeding, and this was done with a shank drill with a split boot, and so the N was placed deep. And you can see the yields are 2.3. We looked at the N early, and this was done with a stream bar about either the last week of March or the first week of April, and those locations were pretty equivalent to the time we're in right now in terms of growth. You'll see that the yields are basically the same, 72.7, end split 70.8, and then the end late was 72.1. So, and the end late would have been about that 5-leaf stage of application, and then the split would have been half at the early stage and half at the late stage. So you can see the yields, there's really no difference in the yields. And this was done on silt loam soils. So if you were doing a sandy soil, you'd obviously probably not want to put your N on at seeding. If you did, you'd certainly want to use a preservative to keep it from leaching on you if you got excessive precipitation. For the due to protein at those times of applications, if you look again at the average bars on the far right, I think this is pretty telling and pretty expected. The later you put the N on and the more you put on later, the higher the protein will be for the winter wheat. The one thing that I think you'll note there is that the N at seeding time has a tendency to run about 0.4 to 0.6 lower than putting the N on in the spring of the year. So one needs to keep that in mind. And if you want to put a majority on at seeding time, but you're concerned then about protein, you either come in and do the protein management or you do a split application, do a majority of it at seeding and come back with some more in the spring, someplace between 4 and 5 leaf stage to continue to try to build yield, but to try to build that protein back up as well. A little bit back to the current stage that we're in and managing your nitrogen for plants or a field that has poor vigor or is low stand or doesn't have adequate tiller numbers to get the heads that you want. This is just 2 shots of a plot site at the Winfield answer plot location south of Minot. And you'll note that up in the upper left, the winter wheat was seeded into canola stubble. This picture was taken in December. Early December of this past year, and you can see that our growth is a half a leaf to a leaf at best. If you look at the strip, little bit of fallow that was in between some of the canola strips, we just seeded right through. You can see we had the moisture to get the plant to germinate, and we had 1/4 to 2.5 leaf winter wheat there. So quite a difference based on the moisture available for germination at that site. What I wanted to mention, though, if you look in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, the head numbers that we kind of use to make determinations whether we want to go in early and get the nitrogen on earlier, if we've got the flexibility to wait till that 4 to 5 leaf stage to put the nitrogen on. If we've got main stem plus tillers to create head numbers in that 50 to 70 plants per square foot, we're pretty comfortable and think we've then got the flexibility to do it any time from now up until that 5 leaf stage or 4 or 5 leaf development stage. And so let's just move on here, and I'll just kind of give you a little demonstration. Some plants here. If you look at the 2 plants on the left that was seeded 4 inches deep, didn't survive the spring. It just didn't have an adequate crown, wasn't able to emerge soon enough from that depth to develop adequate crown reserve to make the winter. But if you look at the second one that was seeded about 2.5 inches deep, it's got a main stem, and there is actually a tiller there. The plant was quite weak in itself as well, being seeded that deep. But if we were sitting there then with that situation, or excuse me, it did not have any tillers, if we just had the main stem on that second plant, and then we assume that we had 20 plants per square foot this spring, so we'd have the potential for about 20 heads. That'd be a situation where I'd want to be getting out there and getting at least 25 pounds of N on, and in most cases, the growers are going to come in, and if they're going to be doing some N, they're going to probably put most of it on. But this would be a situation where sometime next week, I'd probably be seriously considering in North Dakota and South Dakota be trying to get that nitrogen on to enhance tillering and the development of that plant. If you look at the third plant, there's 1 tiller there plus the main head, so you've got 2 heads per plant times the 20 plants per square foot, so you have about 40. That one's kind of on the borderline. If the plants look pretty vigorous in the spring, I think you could probably take some time and have a little flexibility there, but I probably have a tendency to want to come in a little bit earlier with the nitrogen there as well. Then where I get to feel comfortable is those next 2 plants that were seeded at that inch depth. They had 2 tillers plus the main stem, so you got 60 potential heads if you had 20 plants per square foot. And then the far right one had the 3 tillers plus the main stem, so there was a potential of 80 heads per square foot there. Those latter 3 were in pretty good shape, and so we've got flexibility of waiting probably all the way up to that 5 leaf stage. Unless you think you're really short of N based on your soil tests, and you put very little nitrogen down in the plant in the fall. Just to re-emphasize the importance of that early nitrogen if you have a poor stand. I'm not sure how well you can see the photo up in the upper left-hand corner. This was at that Ellendale site in the 2002-2003 winter when we had quite a bit of winter kill and injury. You notice Jerry, a North Dakota variety that's got pretty good winter hardiness on the left. And you can see that the rows are fairly green and pretty good stand and fairly good vigor. If you look at the Jageline, a Kansas type variety on the right, you'll notice that there's glare spots and the plant stands vary from anywhere from 6 to 12 plants per square foot. And obviously the vigor was considerably reduced in the growth. It was quite a bit behind the Jerry. If you look at the nitrogen from the early N application versus the 4-leaf N, and I was supposed to wait till 5, but the farmer came out of me and I just had to get the N on because I could see a leaf to leaf and a half difference already at the 4-leaf stage. And we put the rest of the N on at that point. And instead of waiting until the 5-leaf. But you can see that with the Jageline, we picked up almost 7.5 bushels with that early end versus the late end. And you look at the Jerry, that was pretty vigorous. Basically, there's no yield difference. That's 78 for the early versus 80 for the late. And then if you look at a couple varieties that are really early in maturity and like to have a tendency to do their tillering early in the stage cycle of the plant, the Wesley had a 17 bushel advantage or 18 bushel advantage for the early nitrogen versus the late, and another one is Dakota that's pretty early that had about 11 to 12 bushel advantage. So you can see that you get in those situations where you have poor vigor, you have lost stand, that early nitrogen can play a pretty big advantage to you in those years. Otherwise, we don't see much difference. Looking at protein, before I go and explain this slide, all I would say is that if you think you've got an adequate fertility program to attain the yields that you're expecting, the process of applying nitrogen after flowering to increase protein on winter wheat is probably a process that will cost you money and not make you money. But if you think that your yields are going to exceed what your nitrogen program is, and you think that your protein levels might be low or going below 12% and you'll be experiencing discounts, then this is something that you can consider. We've been getting a lot of questions the last 3 to 4 years about can we increase protein levels in winter wheat like we're doing with spring wheat by adding that 10 gallons of 28% or 30 pounds of nitrogen that's in that 10 gallons with 10 gallons of water, and then using a broadcast flat fan type nozzle to broadcast it across that crop. Can we increase the protein of winter wheat? So we set up some trials a year ago. If you look at the first 2 bars, I'm going to see if I can draw a circle here. If you look at those first 2 bars that I've circled there, those are comparable. The yellow stands for foliar fungicide treatments, and the blue stands for, the yellow stands for no fungicide treatments, and the blue stands for foliar fungicide treatments within those. But what we did there on those first 2 bars is we applied urea at seeding with a drill in the fall for a 60 bushel yield goal. And so that's the first 2 bars. And the second bar then, you see the increase of about 0.5% protein. And that's where we added the 30 pounds of nitrogen through the 10 gallons of UAN. And it occurred both on the fungicide and the non-fungicide treated plots. And you can see the same thing then in the next 2, where we've got the UAN in the spring for an 85 yield goal. We got the same reaction, and then again in the last 2 sets of bars where we had the early nitrogen and then a later split application for an 85 bushel yield goal. We still saw that increase in protein with that post anthesis prior to milk stage nitrogen application. Okay, so when to apply N summary. If you're looking at nitrogen for yield, early spring if we need to increase the head numbers, or no later than prior to jointing, or up to, in other words, up to that 5-leaf stage. And that's the nitrogen that you put on when you're wanting to impact the yield. For protein management, if yield potential higher than the N application rate, and you're concerned about protein that will be less than 12%, then you can consider the protein management application as well. Just in terms of some loss, Dr. Goose had done some laboratory experiments where he had pots of soil with wheat residue on it, so it was residue covered like a no-till situation. He applied in the upper hand corner where it says sprayed the 28% with a flat fan nozzle across the surface. And you can see after 20 days after application that he had lost up to 25 to 30% of that UAN that he had sprayed on the surface with a flat fan nozzle. One way to help reduce that loss a little bit if you're using UAN, the liquid form, is to do a stream or a stream bar, which is shown in the bottom right-hand graph. And you can see he was able to reduce those ammonia losses to 10 to 15%. And so that's one way to retain some of your nitrogen if you're using the liquid formulation. But just in terms of the lead us to the greatest loss, again, if you can apply any and all of these just ahead of a half-inch of rain, you've solved your problem. So that's one thing to consider. The other item that is best in is ammonium nitrate. You can still access that in the States, but it takes some paperwork to get it done because of its explosive nature, with it being used for bombs and stuff. The next alternative, obviously, if you don't have ammonium nitrate, it would be banned with a stream bar or a stream nozzle, then urea with agritane, and then urea. And then if you wanted to add the UAN back into the mixture, it would actually be after that with a broadcast flat fan nozzle. So those are some of the things you can consider when you're looking at loss. One of the last things I want to just mention, I'm showing this slide, if you've been in any of the presentations over the years, you've probably seen this. This is from 2004 from Ellendale again. If you look at the first set of bars that have the 1X at the base, that nitrogen was 45 gallons or 135 pounds of UAN with a drill and a deep band at seeding time. And so you can see that the yellow bars were no foliar fungicides and the green bars received foliar fungicide. So you can see we picked up 5, 6, 7 bushels with a fungicide, but we had fertilized for approximately an 80 to 85 bushel yield goal. So our nitrogen was short in this situation and our protein levels were pretty low. If you look at the 2X rates, they had received that same application as the 1X columns at seeding time with the drill, but then we came across those plots with 45 gallons, so instead of 135 pounds, we were receiving 270 pounds of them. The thing that I wanted to point out is similar to the fungicide, if you compare the yellow bar in the early 2X at 110.9 bushels to the 1X bar at 104.6, we basically picked up about the same amount of yield increase with the extra nitrogen as we did with the fungicide. But what I think there then, as you look at the green columns where we had the extra N plus the fungicide, we were picking up substantial increase over the non-treated single rate nitrogen. So we were picking up close to 25 to 30 bushels with both the fungicide and with the nitrogen. So I think what you're seeing there is there is a plant health relationship in both nutrients and in disease management that sometimes can limit either of those products from showing their total true increases. And so as you add nitrogen and attempting to achieve more yield goal, just be cognizant plant health might hold you back if you're not treating that plant properly from a disease management perspective. With that, we've got trials again with Joel Ransom and NDSU and the South Dakota states scattered across our 2 states. We'll be having tours at these sites and we'll be having data come out of that again this coming fall. And that concludes my comments. Joel and I will remain here as long as you folks want to sit and ask questions, and we'll attempt to answer them. NDSU will be posting the webinar on their website, and we will be posting it on our website as well. And you can see that in the upper left-hand corner at wintercereals.us. And so we'll now stand for questions. Okay, the WSM, Watery Stage Nitrogen Application. So in other words, it's the nitrogen for the protein management was applied after flowering cleat, but before that watery stage turns to milk stage. What form of N are you putting down? We're putting down several forms of N. Most of our spring applications in the past have been done with the 28% UAN. Most of our nitrogen last 3 years have been done at seeding time is done with urea. So we've got some mix of the nitrogen sources out there. This spring, the DU trials for the first time will be be applying some urea in the spring of the year as well on the surface. And I think John Lukach's numbers are both a combination, again, of some urea in the spring and UAN in the spring. So he's got a combination of nutrients with different products.
I think there's a question about root growth and water.
Yeah, a little bit.
So there's that one. Let's see it. What effect this is. Do you want to respond to that, Angela?
Okay, there's a question about the effect of water, standing water on root growth, and that's certainly a big concern. There's a very good chance that the roots growth will be minimal under a situation where there's standing water. I think more concerned in this early stage of development is we need to start getting some tissue that's going to start photosynthesizing. So before we can even have root growth, we need to have some spring foliar growth. So I'm also concerned that the standing water is going to impact the rate at which we get new leaf development, and also develop some carbohydrates that will allow us to grow the roots. But it's a big problem. Anytime you have excessive moisture, you get restricted root growth, so you tend to have problems in getting phosphorus and other nutrients that depend upon root mass. That's another question.
Okay, I see two other questions here. Did the increased N and fungicide applications pay for themselves? It depends on each site, what the level of the yield increase, what the price of the weed is, and what the price of the product is. Actually, in that trial in 2004, even though that wasn't an intended treatment to double apply the N, which it wouldn't have taken that much N to get us to those yield levels, but even at that rate of additional N at that time with the price of the weed, with the price of the nitrogen, it did pay for itself. And we very seldom had it on the U.S. side of the border that the fungicides haven't paid. It's probably only been 10 years that we've had probably 2 or 3 locations that it hasn't. Let's see, what was the next question? Have you ever done any tests with liquid urea? No, we have not conducted any tests with liquid urea. Joel, are you knowledgeable of anything with NDSU on that?
We did. We just briefly did that anthesis application instead of with UAN with liquid urea. I think the issue with liquid urea, for all practical purposes, it would be like urea, is that you got to get into solution, and it does take a little bit of trickiness. There's a bit of a challenge of getting it to dissolve. But the other thing is it doesn't hold up very well during the cold months, and so it's not readily available. But yeah, you can solubilize urea with a little bit of work and put it on just like the UAN, but it's not going to have all the characteristics of UAN because it's going to be 100% urea.
Let's see, another question. Any test done with ESN environmentally safe for a longer period of nitrogen availability? I know both Dr. Goose and Dr. Franson, after sitting through a presentation with them in their soil seminar this spring, did not share with us any positive results in terms of utilization of ESN, particularly on winter wheat. There is some concern also that, particularly if you're using ESN in the spring of the year, that it may actually hold that nitrogen too long before it becomes available to the winter wheat, since it's an early season crop.
I think just to add to that, the data out of Minnesota with spring wheats, they did not. It was actually a fairly good study over a number of locations. They didn't find any yield advantage with the ESN, regardless of the ratio that it was with the irregular urea. But they did see a consistent protein enhancement. So, and that's something we're putting more emphasis on, especially in these wet years. Maybe in the wet year like last year, ESN would even have a little more potential than normal.
The one thing I would comment towards some of those types of places, John Lukach at Langdon has done several years with agrotane. And, of course, it depends on the year and when you apply. Some years you get the rain right after application, so the agrotane doesn't show any results because everything's effective. But on those years where there is potential for some loss, John has been showing us some pretty positive numbers for the use of agrotane for the surface application of urea in the spring of the year when you got residue situations. Joel, question here. If you did apply liquid urea, what would be the best rate so you don't burn the wheat? Have you got any experience with?
Well, if you're talking about that post-anthesis, we would still stick with that 30-pound rate. It doesn't appear to be substantially less, toxic to the leaves than UAN, and so I would still go with that 30-pound rate.
And that's blended with the water again as well.
Yep.
10 gallons of water. 10 gallons. Yeah. The one thing I would, not talking liquid urea, but talking about UAN, the 28% or 32%, depending where you're from and what your source is that, if you're using a flat fan nozzle, that's going to be much more injurious than, say, a stream bar or stream nozzle. We've applied rates all the way up at this early stage now before you get complete cover. With the stream nozzles, we applied all the way up to 65 gallons of the 28%, and at the early stages when it's cool and there's some moisture around, and we've not seen any injury to our wheat.
Yeah, certainly. Let's not confuse that post-anthesis application, which is done targeting the foliage with a flat fan versus the earlier application. You want to use the streamer bars, and there you don't have the restrictions on rates. If you've got to come in with whatever you need to get your yield goal, I'd crank it up to that point and use stream bars, and you'll pick up a little bit of injury where the droplets hit the leaves, but generally there won't be any that will give any negative consequences. And I think that would apply to the UAN or to the liquid urea. And, if it doesn't look like there's rain in the forecast, the nice thing about putting some agrotane with your urea, it gives you a little more protection. This day of high fertilizer prices, it might very well be worth it.
Question from Tyler says, when stream barring, are you trying to hit the plants or in between the rows? We don't worry about it. Generally, what's happening with the stream bars and the stream nozzles that the droplet's so large that when it hits that leaf that it rolls off. That's never been a concern of ours of trying to be able that precise in terms of worrying about the wheat.
Totally agree.
Let's see. Question here from NDSUA. If we have a head count now of 80 plants per square foot, would you recommend a split? I'm assuming you mean a split application or a single early application. Half the N was applied at seeding. Average is 2.5 tillers per plant row. Well, I'll tell you what, right now, if that was my field and I was managing at my home place, I'd probably be sitting here waiting until I see a rain come and then applying my N ahead of that rain shower if I've got that flexibility and I'm not getting started in the rest of my field work. I think you've got the flexibility to go from now until you get to that 5-leaf stage, which is a really nice situation to be in. The other thing that I would say is we haven't talked about it a little bit, is to take a look at what variety you have. You've got plenty of plant stems there right now and plenty of head potential. Do we lose everything? Discrete one. Okay. All right, my screen went dead. I thought I lost you guys. But looking at the varieties, if you've got a tall variety like Jerry that doesn't have the straw strength of something like an Susceptible or a Falcon or some of those shorter varieties that are out there on the landscape, you might want to have a tendency to hold off on the end a little bit. The early end can cause additional tillering and a little less stem diameter and probably cause a little extra lodging in those tall varieties. So that may be one of the factors you want to take into consideration as you try to determine when you put that end on here. The other thing that I would respond to that, when you've got that flexibility, if you remember that protein graph, those 4 different treatments on the check, this gives you the flexibility of waiting until that 4 to 5 week, and then that end that you put on then this spring will help you maintain that protein level too, and you may not have to be concerned about that protein application after heading.
Before we conclude, and I'm not stopping the questions, if any of you that have been out and have looked at winter wheat fields this spring, if you could just maybe put a note in the chat box as to whether you noted any injury or loss of vigor, or if you basically observed good stands. Give us kind of an idea of what kind of injury we can expect to see state as a whole.
The other thing is, just let us know by email or however you want if you think these seminars are valuable, and if we should conduct another one sometime in July or August to get you folks ready for seeding 1 week this fall. And those kind of comments help direct where we go and expend our energies.
I think maybe given the time and don't see any more questions, let's wrap it up. You want to say farewell?
Jeff, I'd just like to thank NDSU and for all of you folks as participants, and feel free to give your extension agents and your ducks and lemon agronomists a call, and in both the states and in Canada. I know the dean has several of them from Canada on as well, and they're good experts as well. So thanks a lot for your help, and I'm glad to see we're not seeing any injury from Wayne, because she's got about as much winter wheat up in that county as we got any place in the state. So we're going to sign off and be good. Catch you later. We'll let you guys continue to answer, but we're going to close down on our comments. Have a good day.
Yes. Okay. There we are.